We were going to, the paper sort of goes into some of the policy rationales. I've decided not to go into that because I think we've talked about that quite a lot. But just to give you some context of where our partnership came out of. So Capital Region Housing embarked on a new mixed income model, or at least new in the Canadian context, in the way that we are approaching it, where it's still a bit of a test case. The building that we're testing it out on is Parkdale 1, which is located in our downtown core, 70 units, and it opened up and we started moving residents in May of this year, so it's still fairly new. For us, we were really focusing on that third piece in terms of sustainability, mostly on the financial actually. That was one of the big driving forces in terms of how do we create a building that can sustain itself so that we can avoid that trap of deferred maintenance and do all those other things, and then also looking at around social sustainability. So the way that we have approached mixed income, we decided that it was important for us to do mixed income but still tackle our priority list. So the criteria to be eligible into the mixed income building is all still under the regulatory framework, which does have its limitations because it does exclude some citizenship statuses in Canada, and of course there's the income limit and an asset limit test as well. But what it does is 20% of those 70 units are what we would consider traditional social housing. So it follows those rather strict and punitive rules. This building is not under an operating agreement, so we can sort of massage the rules as we go. 60% of those units are what we call mixed RGI or unregulated RGI. So we're still doing a 30% rent geared to income, but it is at any point on the income scale. So it doesn't matter where you are, if you're over the income threshold or not, we'll do 30% and we'll just verify income and set your rent on an annual basis. And then at the 20% we have market. Edmonton's vacancy rate is fairly high right now, and so market is a very generous market because Capital Region Housing doesn't go to the top end of what would be considered market. But the other big thing that we did with this building is this is our way of trying to get around the Alberta rule that we have to ask people once they're starting to do better and start having higher income in their household to leave their housing. So just like Sarah was mentioning, Capital Region Housing also is very much wanting to make sure that people can put roots down in their communities, that their housing doesn't have to be in question regardless of what sort of program, quote unquote, from a government perspective, they fall into. So those who sort of enter in the building under those sort of more traditional social housing rules, if they reach the income threshold, the only difference for them is that they sign a new tenancy agreement that, because for that 60% bulk of units, there's no legislative requirement to do what we're doing, so it all has to be done by contract. And so they need to sign a new tenancy agreement that way. And so we're trying this out. The benefit that we see in trying this model is that because of the way Alberta allocates housing and in social housing is based on a point score model, which I usually explain as the fairest way of being unfair to everybody, just because it's really transparent, but it also reduces people down to points. So you get like 3 points for each dependent. So if you want to think of your kids as like 3 points. But the biggest thing is also rent to income ratio points, where you can get up to 21 points as a result. And so the people who go into the social housing units tend to be really at the top of the list. So they have the most points. Usually that also means that they're paying the highest rent to income ratio, usually at a 70 or even sometimes 100%. What happens is that when you're at the bottom of the list, most of the people there are actually not as significantly impacted by rent to income ratio. So they're still over 30%, but they might be at 50%, which is still not great when you're living in market, but it's unfortunately in the Alberta system not at the point where you are considered to be most in need. So our 60% of what we're calling mixed RGI targets that part of our priority list, so that we can go to people and say, rather than waiting the years that you are anticipating to be waiting on our list, we can move you in because your income on a 30% RGI basis meets the target income rent for this building. So we have an algorithm in our system that looks at the overall sort of revenue for the building, which allows us to then, when we have a vacant unit, determine what the optimal sort of income amount would be. And so we have a variety of different subsidy levels, if for lack of a better term, in terms of what that building looks like. So we're still in the midst of filling it. It's not quite full, so it's still a bit of an experiment in terms of whether or not this is the right model, if we have to start changing things. But as we were progressing towards this model, one of the challenges is that while there's really great research out there, it's mostly American. And so we thought, well, we should probably find out what's happening in Canada and what other people who are already doing mixed income are doing. And so my team and I did not have necessarily the capacity to do that all ourselves. So we entered into a partnership with the University of Victoria. My degree, my Master's of Public Administration comes from that university, so I happen to know that all of those fine students have to do capstone projects, which is a really great way of being able to share the research with really interested and interesting partners that are going through the program. And so when we put the call out to have someone help us with mixed income and sort of what the best practices were from a Canadian perspective, Ian very quickly, I think within less than 24 hours, was emailing me saying, this is the one I want, this is the project, can we please work together? And so this is really a bit more so about the work that he did for his capstone project for us. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Esther. I'll just grab the clicker.
Absolutely.
So yeah, as Esther mentioned, part of my capstone project for my master's degree at the University of Victoria is working with CRH, Calgary Region Housing, to sort of determine, are there certain best practices? I like Mark's term, promising practices. I may run with that one. Is there certain best practices to consider when moving towards the mixed income model and redeveloping or building new mixed income developments? And that sort of overall question led to all sorts of other questions that you see right there for me to tackle. In terms of my approach, just really quickly, of course I did a literature review of available research in urban policy and housing research studies. I also conducted my own participant interviews with about 7 social and affordable housing organizations across the country. Most of whom directly operated mixed income or mixed market housing, and we're in the midst of building new or redeveloping or regenerating their public housing, moving more towards a mixed income model. I also collected some data from the same participants' data collection sheet just to get an idea of their overall bedroom mix. How many units do you have? What's your building mix? What sort of income mix do you employ? Get an idea of their vacancy rates, turnover rates, that sort of thing. And it allowed for a bit of a comparison with the private rental market. I won't harken a lot on the research literature. I'll talk mostly just about my findings, some of the promising practices that came from my interviews, as well as a few insights from the data collection sheet, which I'll start with first. When surveying the participants, what I found was that most of their portfolios weren't terribly dense. Vast majority of the buildings were side-by-side row or townhouse style units. Over half of the buildings were that style. And actually a vast majority of them were even semi-detached, so even less dense. And arguably, obviously, you want to move towards apartment construction. It's just more efficient use, denser housing, more efficient use of the land base. And it's sort of, as you can see with the graph on the right side, there's been a real march towards increased densification in Canada. About 17 years ago, in 2000, it was about a quarter of all housing starts in Canada. Now it's about half of all housing starts in Canada. So there's a real march towards densification in Canada's urban centers. Perhaps not surprisingly, vacancy rates were much lower than in the private rental market. Turnover also was much lower. In the private rental market, it's about 20% versus 6%. And finally, I thought I would find some sort of magical rental or income mix, but I didn't. It really depended on each respondent's portfolios and the operating agreements that they had with each building. There was no magic formula that I found. In terms of common building and unit characteristics, this is mostly from my interviews. Participant organizations were, of course, ensuring that their redevelopments or new developments were well integrated with the community of the surrounding neighborhood. They weren't obviously not going for that sort of social housing look or stigma, as Professor Friedman alluded to earlier. They were all densifying. They're all moving towards increased density. For the most part, the buildings offered in-unit amenities that didn't really differ at all from one program type to the other. So Unit A looked exactly like Unit D. Unit D looked exactly like Unit Z. So it allowed for maximum flexibility. Different tenants come in under different program types, different varying levels of subsidies. You can just interchange the units. You don't have a unit that's Unit 403 is only can only be for high subsidy individuals. There were some exceptions. There was one participant organization that offered above market or premium units, and that particular proponent, the units did differ slightly. They had ensuite laundry, and those were the only units that had balconies. However, in that development, that was the only proponent that offered full market units as well, and those market units didn't differ from the subsidy units at all. The units were peppered throughout the development. There was no single floors or single buildings of just subsidized housing or just market housing. In every case, every participant I spoke to, when I asked them how are you generating additional revenues, all of them were reviewing the use of their commercial and common space to try to see if they could be reconfigured. A few examples. Some were taking a tough look at common space that they perhaps leased out to community groups at cost. Some were saying, are we doing the best by our residents by not maximizing the amount of income that we could lease this space out to? One participant even mentioned taking a look at their common laundry rooms and perhaps repurposing them. The in-suite washers and dryers are getting quite a lot less expensive. Perhaps they could incorporate those into the units and convert those common laundry spaces into, in his case, 38 different common laundry rooms into 3-bedroom units. In his mind, that was a whole other building added to his portfolio. And of course, all were employing the latest building envelope and environmental technology to drive down operating costs or to reduce tenant utility costs. I asked participants a little bit about, I just wanted to make some observations and learn from them about resident interaction in their developments and what sort of strategies they employ in terms of income mix. Most rated tenant interaction to be moderate, and they felt that any conflict within their communities was mostly personality related, and it was not due to the income mixing. The income mixing that they employed really spanned the spectrum, from deeply subsidized right up to near market, and in the case of that one proponent, at market and above market. What was really interesting too is that a lot of participants talked about ensuring that they had that sort of middle income or that moderate subsidy. One proponent actually made sure to set aside a certain proportion of units for those participants with, those tenants with moderate incomes to sort of bridge the gap between low income folks and those paying market rents. Yeah, so they didn't want a bimodal split, as one participant said, you know, a bunch of folks at the low end and a bunch of market folks and nothing in between. Most of the participants, as I mentioned, offered, their idea of market was near market. So those were units priced at about 10% below prevailing market rates. Like I mentioned, there was that one participant that offered full market and also above market rents. That one participant actually experienced the highest turnover of all the participants that I surveyed. I felt that was one interesting observation, that if you're looking to go more full market or above market, you may result in obviously more turnover and perhaps increased vacancy losses because market tenants have a choice and they will often move. There's lots of common activities that that the housing proponents use to try to bring residents together, barbecues, computer rooms. Some had after school programs like a homework club. There was even beekeeping. The most common cited activity that they offer in their buildings was gardening. Actually, for some reason they felt that was the best way that they brought folks together. At the time that I contacted participants, none were employing homeowner tenure in the mix. They were all staying within rental tenure in their mixed income communities. And in the Canadian literature, there was it was fairly negative, what I read in the literature in terms of mixing homeowner and rental tenure. And some of that was, as Mark had alluded to, was just because they were quite segregated. And then one other interesting observation from participants was the fact that a lot of them were quite open to the fact that they were mixed income. They were a mixed income rental community or rental building. And why not? Because some of these redevelopments are incredible. They offer a lot of great amenities that would appeal to a market tenant. And some even mentioned the idea of marketing to what one participant called the communitarian. So young, upwardly mobile, urban, professional, socially conscious, and really making that pitch like, hey, we've got this great community, we've got wonderful units, you can come and pay your rent, and the rent that you pay is going to help someone else who's paying less. And just one example, this is from a mixed income community in Winnipeg, and again, just very open with the fact that it's marketed in affordable suites. We've got these great common areas. In this particular building, they had a room set aside for smudging ceremonies. There was a Skype conferencing room, electric car co-op with electric car charging stations. But they're very open about what they were as a community and what they were offering. And so I thought that was quite powerful. Finally, these are not common practices, but these are just ideas that came about as I was talking with participants surrounding the areas of governance, tenant supports, and tenant outcome measures. So the first thing that I observed was in the literature it mentions how good management of social and affordable housing can really have an impact on tenant well-being and just their overall satisfaction in terms of living in their community. But being overly policed by rules can really create a negative environment. And the participants that I spoke to really seemed to get that. While they have rules, they weren't overly burdensome. Most participants that I spoke to did not involve tenants in decision-making. Although two participant organizations did, and in really unique ways that I thought were, again, I'm going to use the term promising practices. One participant that I spoke with had tenant representatives, and they act as liaisons between building managers and the tenants. They're there to raise building issues, and they also work with other tenant reps as part of broader community councils to raise awareness of issues in the neighborhood, as well as to raise awareness amongst tenants of available supports within their neighborhood. So I thought that was quite a promising practice. Another community-based provider had a committee structure which actually mirrored their own organizational structure, and those committees provided oversight to the organization and set the organization's operational goals, and those committees were actually tenant dominated. And in addition to that, they actually had a tenant representation on the board of directors. So the whole idea here, why I found it so powerful, is the idea of giving tenants a voice. They have input into decision making. They can more directly address building issues. And they have more direct input into perhaps the creation and modification of common rules for the community. So I thought that was quite powerful. Just two more points. So again, the literature also notes that mixed income on its own does not guarantee positive tenant outcomes, but better targeting of supports can make a difference. And so while all the participants I spoke to offered referrals to support services, there was one participant organization that took it a little bit further, and I felt that was a best practice. They have embedded tenant liaisons within their organization, and so if a tenant reaches out to a property manager for help, or if the property manager on site notices any issues with the tenant, whether it be for behavior or payment difficulties, that sort of thing, they're able to refer the tenant to the tenant liaison. And it can be for simple things such as, I just need help filling out this form. I have no idea how to fill out this form. And these tenant liaisons will do site visits. And even, so while they're doing their site visits, for even simple matters, they may uncover in these site visits more pressing problems like issues with hoarding, lack of clothing, lack of furniture, that sort of thing. So again, I thought that model of having these embedded tenant liaisons was actually quite powerful and allowed for better referral tracking and better targeting of supports to the tenants. And then finally, the folks I spoke to have lots of portfolio measures. So they track turnover, they track service response times, maintenance response times, even elevator downtimes, that sort of thing. But none of them had any tenant outcome measures. But many of them aspired to develop them. Oh, I would love to have some tenant outcome measures. We want to know, are we really improving tenant lives? So many that I spoke to, they were looking to introduce for the first time or reintroduce tenant satisfaction surveys. I think that in and of itself can be a good measure of tenant well-being. Some were going to employ some needs surveys as well of their tenants, and uncover one participant organization was actually doing that, and it uncovered really unique needs by building. So they had a certain building that where English as a second language appeared as a need. So that could be something that they could target for that building. And another had employment services help as one of the identified needs. So stuff like resume writing and interview skills training could be brought in to assist those tenants. I had also thought about perhaps some employment tracking as folks renew their leases annually. Maybe there's a way to track the employment status of tenants and sort of track that over time just to see if that's improving. And then one participant organization was also tracking the reason for leaving, which I thought was a great idea. Was it positive, for positive reason, moving to market housing? Or was it for a neutral reason, they moved out of town? Or for a negative reason, they were evicted due to non-payment or for behavioral issues? I thought that was another interesting measure that could be more broadly adopted. And these were essentially the key, although I made a lot of recommendations to Esther, these were some of the key ones that sort of percolated up. So, densification, make the most of your development footprint. Be completely open and deliberate in marketing your mixed income development as they do offer great amenities and great reasons to live there. Look beyond portfolio measures and develop some tenant outcome measures. Find better ways to track and target tenant supports, perhaps by incorporating tenant liaisons in the organization. And really embrace what I call participatory government or governance. So find ways to better involve tenants in decision making. So those are some of the ideas that really kind of percolated to the surface.
That's it.
Thank you.